This channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the relationship between practices of stillness and how they help to dissolve trauma and also free us of karmic tendencies. In order to get into the topic, we need to start by defining karma in a very, very simplistic way. There may be more mystical ways of defining it, perhaps even better ways of defining it. But for practical purposes, we could define karma as essentially an unstoppable chain reaction, a chain of events. And we can see the effects of karma in our lives by looking at actions that are compulsive, repetitive, and unconscious. So when we start our self-cultivation journey, most of our life will be ran by unconscious drives and desires. Things that we want to get away from, things that we want to chase and achieve. And even on a more micro level, you would see your life being ran by karmic tendencies all the time. So you would start to observe your own reactions and notice that a certain thought pops into your head out of nowhere, or seemingly out of nowhere, that says, we no longer have milk in the fridge. And that would trigger an action for you to make a note on your mobile or run to the store to buy milk. You would feel a certain type of craving in the pit of your stomach, and that would trigger an action to go to the fridge and perhaps eat something. You would feel a certain longing in the back of your head, and that longing would trigger you to grab your phone and text somebody that you are missing perhaps or thinking about. So what you see is an endless chain of a certain type of input, and as a reaction a certain type of impulse and action that takes place in the outside world. And so you could see this as a kind of karmic chain that never really stops. There is input coming into your awareness of a certain craving, a certain thought, a certain emotion, and a certain action that results out of that. And some of these actions are wholesome, and perhaps they are all fairly wholesome, and some might be not working in your favor. And the question then becomes, how do you break those karmic patterns? How do you go about making it so that you gain either the willpower or the control or the ability to respond more correctly to situations, rather than responding simply through compulsion, either genetic or mimetic memory or tendencies that we tend to call, this is just the way I am. And to make things a little bit more complicated, we can layer trauma on top of that. And trauma, as I defined in my previous video, is a kind of psychosomatic disconnect that takes place in our system when we are confronted with a situation that we are not ready to face. We essentially disassociate from it. We cut ourselves off so that we don't have to feel that part of ourselves. And whether it is through trauma or whether we already bring it with us, those kind of disconnections create blind spots. And those blind spots are precisely what keeps karma in place. It keeps karma running. The reason for this is that psychosomatic blind spots, part of ourselves that we don't know and part of our somatics that we are not willing to feel, are blind spots that are nevertheless having an activity of their own. They have a mind of their own. All that activity is happening subconsciously, so we can't even see it. They tend to be a kind of black box. Because we are not willing to feel them, we also cannot gather any information about what's happening inside those psychosomatic blind spots that we either bring with us into this life, that we would call karma, or that we acquire as part of our embodied existence, which we could call trauma. Regardless of whether it's acquired or innate, blind spots that live a life of their own have a very peculiar quality to them, and that is that they are ran by memory that is compulsive and that is running regardless of whether it is the appropriate action or not. And this is the very crux of the whole matter. How do we resolve trauma? How do we resolve karma so that our actions are appropriate, so that our conduct is according to what the moment demands from us, and so that we also feel wholesome and happy in general, which these blind spots truly prevent because we keep getting in our own way. So enter the practice of stillness, right? So we've talked before, we've been really going in depth about embodiment, the practice of feeling our somatics to try to get a read into those blind spots that are there. But getting a read on them is not enough. So something else is needed that is crucial to this. In order to explain what that is, which is the stillness part, I want to draw an analogy from the movie The Matrix. And so in that movie, there comes the point where Neo, or Thomas Anderson, decides to take the red pill. He decides that he wants to wake up from the Matrix. He wants to know what the Matrix is. So he takes the red pill and he is guided into a room where all these guys that work for Morpheus are going to help disconnect him from the Matrix. And then Morpheus says the pill that you took is part of a program that disrupts your input-output carrier signal. In other words, he talks about inputs and outputs, which is very interesting. If you remember the way we started this video, we were talking about how there's input, so you feel a craving, for example, and there's output, the triggered action to go and fetch something from the fridge. There is perceived input, the feeling of longing or the memory of someone you miss, and there is output, the action of picking up and texting them on WhatsApp, for example. And there's input and output happening all the time. Now, when that input and output is conscious and consciously refined, that input-output tends to be in accordance to what the moment requires. But as we just explained, trauma and karma create psychosomatic blind spots where the input and output is simply memory-based and unconscious. So we don't really know it's happening. We only see its results, which seem quite repetitive and not always wholesome. But we seem not to be able to do anything about it. So the practices of embodiment and feeling start to allow us to look inside that blind spot. And now we start to see what's happening. So we see all the input that's taking place. But we also see very clearly the tendency for an automatic firing of an output. In other words, input and output are mushed together. If we were to explain this from a Taoist perspective, you could see that yin and yang are mushed around. There's combinations of yin and yang that are mushed around and stuck to each other in unwholesome ways. So that yin, being the receptive, that's the input, is what we perceive, our ability to perceive. We perceive memories, we perceive somatic sensations, cravings, emotions. And yang, being linear and outy, is the resulting automatic action that comes out of that. So yin and yang are all mushed together. There are inputs coming in and outputs automatically being fired without much thought or care for whether they are wholesome and correct or not. And here's the beauty of the practices that involve stillness, such as perhaps just sitting in abidance or qigong standing, for example, or simply observing your breath. What that forces you to do is it forces you to sit while the input is being received. So you are being yin and you are feeling perhaps very strong emotions bubbling to the surface, thoughts coming up and all kinds of things. And you also observe the tendency for an automatic output to get up and call somebody or start overthinking or eat or whatever. But you are starting to draw a wedge between those two. So input is coming up, coming up, coming up, coming up. And instead of immediate automatic output, you choose for stillness instead and you sit it out. You're just sitting it out. And it's very unpleasant. At first is almost incredibly unpleasant, and the deeper you go, the more unpleasant this becomes, because those inputs, you go deeper into them and they start to become incredibly guttural and very close to your heart, to your solar plexus centers, your throat. They're very strong. But you sit it out anyway. So in essence, what you're learning to do is sit and stew in your own juices. And it feels like you're cooking from the inside. There's a certain friction happening. That friction is happening because you are touching these areas for the first time. So you are feeling them for the first time, and you're feeling the full power of the input that they've been trying to communicate. And at the same time, you are disentangling the tendency for output, which was to dampen the intensity of the perceived input. You wanted to placate or suppress and make it go away, so you would take action in the form of eating or whatever addiction or reactive pattern you had in the past, whatever karmic pattern you had in the past. So what yoga calls tapas, or heat, is the activity of fully feeling blind spots and not doing anything about it, simply sitting it out, being still. What that eventually does is it extricates or separates yin and yang. So that yin and yang that were mushed up, input and output reactions being completely blind and automatic, start to become disentangled by clearly seeing the input and not succumbing to the automatic tendency of the output, but simply sitting it out. What that does is it separates these two. It extricates yin and yang. It separates perception from the automatic tendency to take action. And that's the very gap where freedom from karma sits. That's the very gap that also resolves the trauma, funny enough. So what you're essentially trying to do is learn to receive as much input as the environment brings to you without being triggered to carry out an automatic reaction or an automatic response. True response only comes when you have the ability to do nothing. Everything else is a reaction. So if you have the ability to sit it out, whatever you do from there is going to be a response. That doesn't mean it needs to be pleasant. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily in control or that you have more willpower to control your reactions left or right, because as we've discussed before, willpower is a very scarce resource and is not sustainable for this kind of intensity. You won't be able to be the one who controls this. But if you are willing to feel it and you are willing to let it essentially take you over and flow through you without moving an inch, without moving even a millimeter while you are doing your sitting practice or your standing practice or your laying down practice for that matter, then you are becoming more of a funnel. You are becoming a clean funnel for sensation to hit you without having to do anything about it. And that's where freedom comes into the picture. And that is the role of stillness in this kind of practice, is that stillness forces you to become a clean funnel by simply just taking it, just stewing in your own juices, simply becoming completely available to the input that is taking place. At some point you become so available to the input that you become transparent to the input, and you become the very flow of the input, and you are completely free of outcome. So you can have a clarity of intent, you can fully feel what's happening, your willingness to fully feel and even to essentially die to what is happening, to succumb to the input completely so that you don't have to do something about it, is the very freedom that we're looking for. And notice how different that is from control. Notice how different that is from even our notions of free will. We would like to have free will so that we can, quote unquote, do whatever we please or whatever we feel like. But what we actually want is to have peace and to have the freedom to act correctly and appropriately, to act according to the moment and be one with it, which is true freedom, as opposed to the egoic notion of going against the grain of the moment and imposing our individuality, even if it is not appropriate to what's taking place. So in summary, trauma and karma could be defined as psychosomatic blind spots that create a repetitive cycle based on automatic or a momentous, unstoppable chain reaction of input and output. Our practices of stillness allow us to separate input from output, separate yin from yang, and to later on recombine them into a single whole that is wholesome, non-repetitive, non-compulsive, and therefore responsive instead of reactive. It is a systematic practice. It takes time to separate those things, and it takes a lot of discomfort. It takes a lot of sitting in discomfort and not doing anything about it other than feeling it. But the stillness part is the part that does the trick of the separation that we're talking about, and that separation is crucial for self-cultivation and eventually self-realization. So this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. As you see, I've done a video that is longer than I typically do. Very curious to hear about your comments in the comment section. And as usual, other people may benefit from this content. And if you think it's valuable, then liking the video, sharing it, and subscribing to the channel. It's very motivating to me, and it also makes the content available to others. As usual, I'll be back with more. And until then, thanks for listening and cheerio. Bye-bye.